The cabin lay nestled in the embrace of towering pine trees, a solitary beacon of warmth in an otherwise frigid and unforgiving wilderness. It was the kind of place where the world felt far away, where whispers of the past lingered in the cracks of the wooden beams, and the howl of the wind carried secrets only the brave dared to interpret. Inside, the golden glow of a crackling fire danced across the walls, casting fleeting shadows that seemed alive, restless, as though the past itself had taken shape and wandered the room. Ethan sat on the worn leather couch, his elbows resting on his knees, staring at Zira and Rex across the room. Zira, with her ethereal presence, leaned against the kitchen counter, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders like a waterfall of silk. Her piercing eyes, the color of storm-tossed seas, watched Rex as he lay curled by the hearth. There was a tranquility in the scene that felt almost unnatural, a harmony too perfect to be real, and it gnawed at Ethan. He could never quite shake the feeling that he was an outsider in his own home. The way Zira spoke to Rex softly, as if sharing secrets meant only for the two of them, lit a flame of jealousy deep in Ethan's chest. It wasn't just the affection she showed their dog, it was the intensity of it, the way her fingers brushed his fur as if invoking an ancient ritual. Rex's eyes, deep pools of amber, seemed to respond with a wisdom that unsettled Ethan, as though the dog understood far more than he should. "Dinner's ready," Zira said finally, her voice like honey laced with thunder, pulling Ethan from his thoughts. She didn't look at him as she spoke, her attention still fixed on Rex. The dog's ears perked, and he rose to his feet with a grace that seemed almost human, following Zira to the table. Ethan forced a smile, masking the turmoil inside him. He joined them at the small, hand-carved dining table, the wood smooth from years of use. Zira had cooked something simple, roast vegetables and bread, but the aroma was intoxicating. As they ate, the silence between them was heavy, a tangible thing that pressed against Ethan's chest. "Do you ever wonder," he began, breaking the silence, "what Rex thinks about us?" Zira looked up, her lips curving into a faint smile, but her eyes held a depth that made Ethan shiver. "He knows more than we give him credit for," she said, her voice carrying an undercurrent of something unspoken. "Animals see things we can't," Ethan chuckled, but it was a hollow sound. "Like what?" "Ghosts." Zira didn't laugh. She reached down, brushing her hand along Rex's head. "Not ghosts," she said softly. "Connections. The threads that bind us together across time." Ethan's stomach tightened. Her words felt like a challenge, a reminder of something he couldn't grasp. The fire in the hearth crackled, sending sparks flying into the air, and for a moment the shadows on the walls seemed to stretch and twist, forming shapes that defied explanation. That night, as Zira slept beside him, Ethan lay awake, staring at the wooden ceiling. Rex was at the foot of the bed, his breathing steady and rhythmic, a quiet reassurance that felt more like an echo of something ancient than a mere dog's presence. Ethan's mind raced with thoughts he couldn't articulate. There was a weight in the air, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The storm came suddenly, a furious onslaught of wind and rain that battered the windows and shook the walls. Ethan sat up, his heart pounding. Zira stirred but didn't wake, her face serene even as the tempest raged outside. Rex, however, was alert, his ears perked and his body tense. He stared at the window, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Ethan followed Rex's gaze, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Outside, barely visible through the sheets of rain, were shapes, 5 of them, indistinct but unmistakable. They moved like shadows, weaving in and out of the trees, their forms flickering as though caught between worlds. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. They were dogs, or at least they resembled dogs, but there was something otherworldly about them. Their eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the darkness, and their movements were fluid, almost hypnotic. Rex stood, his growl growing louder, but there was no fear in his posture. Instead, there was recognition, a strange familiarity that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. The storm seemed to intensify as the shapes drew closer, their forms becoming more distinct. Ethan reached for Zira, shaking her awake. She opened her eyes, and for a moment, they glowed like the apparitions outside. It was brief, a flicker, but it was enough to leave Ethan speechless. She sat up, her gaze immediately locking onto the window. "They've come," she whispered, her voice tinged with something Ethan couldn't place. Was it fear, or something else entirely? Reverence, perhaps. "Who?" Ethan demanded, his voice rising with panic. "What are those things?" Zira stood, her movements deliberate and unhurried, as though she had been expecting this moment. She placed a hand on Rex's head, and the dog calmed, his growl fading into silence. Turning to Ethan, she said, "They're not here to harm us. They're here to remind us." Remind us of what? Ethan's voice cracked, his fear giving way to frustration. "What the hell is going on, Zira?" She didn't answer. Instead, she opened the door, letting the storm's fury rush inside. The spectral dogs stood just beyond the threshold, their glowing eyes fixed on the trio. One of them stepped forward, its form shifting slightly, as though it couldn't decide whether it was flesh or shadow. It stopped inches from Zira, who knelt and extended her hand. The apparition lowered its head, brushing against her fingers, and Ethan felt a surge of emotion that wasn't his own grief, love, and a longing so profound it made his chest ache. "They're pieces of us," Zira said, her voice trembling. "Pieces of our story." Ethan stared, his mind reeling. The storm, the apparition, Zira's cryptic words, it was too much. Yet, as he looked at the spectral dogs, he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward them, an inexplicable connection that defied logic. One of the dogs turned its gaze to him, its eyes locking with his. In that moment, Ethan felt as though he was falling, spiraling through a kaleidoscope of memories that weren't his, or perhaps they were. As the storm began to subside, Ethan realized that his world would never be the same. Whatever this was, this connection, this truth, it was only the beginning. The storm had passed, leaving the air thick with an eerie stillness. Outside, the forest seemed transformed, shimmering with dew, every leaf glistening like glass under the pale light of the moon. The spectral dogs lingered near the edges of the cabin's clearing, their forms blending seamlessly with the shadows of the trees. Ethan stood by the window, watching them, his breath shallow and uneven. Zira moved beside him, her presence as quiet and commanding as ever. She rested a hand on his arm, and though her touch was light, it felt as though she had pressed directly on the turmoil inside him. "You feel it, don't you?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a warmth that contrasted with the chill in the room. Ethan turned to her, searching her face for answers. Feel what he demanded, though he already knew. His pulse thrummed with something primal, an awareness that had awakened when those glowing eyes first locked onto his. "They're not strangers to us," Zira said, her gaze steady. "They're fragments of you, of me, of Rex. They carry memories we've buried so deeply that we don't even know they're ours." Ethan shook his head, stepping away. "This is insane," he muttered, his voice trembling. "You're telling me those things out there are pieces of me? Of us? How is that even possible?" Before Zira could answer, Rex rose from his spot near the hearth, his ears pricked as though listening to an unspoken command. He padded to the door, glancing back at Ethan and Zira with an intensity that left no room for hesitation. Zira followed without a word, pulling the door open. Cold air swept inside, raising goosebumps on Ethan's skin. "Are you just going to follow him?" Ethan asked, his voice rising in disbelief. "Yes," Zira said simply, stepping out into the night. Ethan hesitated, torn between his fear and an inexplicable pull to follow. Finally, he grabbed his coat and stepped outside, the chill biting through the fabric like needles. The forest felt alive in a way he had never noticed before. Each sound, each movement in the underbrush, thrummed with purpose. The spectral dogs stood in a loose circle at the edge of the clearing, their glowing eyes fixed on the humans approaching them. Rex walked directly into their midst, his tail wagging in greeting. The largest of the ghostly figures, a towering creature with fur that shimmered like frost, stepped forward. It stood before Ethan, its form flickering slightly, as though it wasn't entirely bound to this world. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the air around him seemed to shift. The forest blurred, the ground beneath his feet softened, and a sudden rush of heat enveloped him. The vision struck like a lightning bolt. He was no longer standing in the forest, but in the heart of a sun-scorched desert. An endless expanse of golden sand stretched in every direction, shimmering with heat waves. A massive tent loomed before him, its crimson fabric fluttering in a dry, scorching wind. Nearby, an oasis glittered like a jewel, its waters surrounded by lush palm trees. Ethan was not alone. He turned to see Zira, but she was different, not the woman he knew, but a vision of her from another time. She wore flowing garments of white and gold, her dark hair braided with beads that caught the sunlight. Her eyes were the same, though piercing, otherworldly, as if she could see straight into his soul. At her side stood Rex, but he, too, had changed. He was larger, his fur dark and sleek, his presence more commanding. A guardian in every sense of the word. His eyes glowed faintly, just as the apparitions had, and when he looked at Ethan, there was recognition in his gaze. Zira turned to Ethan, a smile playing on her lips. "You came back," she said, her voice carrying a weight of familiarity and longing that sent a shiver down his spine. I don't understand," Ethan stammered, but as he spoke, he realized that his voice, too, was different, deeper, more resonant. His body felt stronger, heavier, clothed in strange but familiar garb. A sword hung at his side, its hilt worn from years of use. He glanced at his hands, calloused and scarred, and felt a surge of memories that weren't his own battlefields, nights under starlit skies, Zira's laughter echoing in the wind. The vision shifted again, blurring like a film reel spinning too fast. Suddenly they were under siege. The tent was ablaze, the oasis overrun by shadowy figures with gleaming blades. Zira stood in the center of the chaos, her hands raised, chanting words in a language Ethan didn't understand. A shield of light surrounded her, but it was faltering. Rex was beside her, snarling and snapping at the attackers, his body a blur of motion. Ethan, no, not Ethan, but the man he once was, rushed to Zira's side, his sword cutting through the darkness. The connection between the three of them was palpable, a lifeline that kept them moving as one. And then came the moment that froze his heart. Rex leapt forward, intercepting a blow meant for Zira. The blade sank deep and Rex let out a pained yelp that echoed across the battlefield. Time seemed to stop as Zira screamed, her shield shattering, and Ethan caught her as she fell. The light around them grew brighter, blinding, and then nothing. Ethan gasped, the vision fading as he staggered back. The spectral dog before him, the largest of the five, locked eyes with him once more, and Ethan felt a jolt of recognition. It was Rex, not just the dog he knew, but the guardian from that life, and from so many others. "You saw it," Zira said, her voice soft but steady. She stood beside him, her face serene yet filled with emotion. "That was one of the lives we shared. One of the many." Ethan turned to her, his hands trembling. What was that? How is this possible?" "It's always been possible," Zira said. "You just forgot. We all did, until now." Ethan's gaze shifted to the spectral dogs, each one watching him with an intensity that made his chest ache. He could feel fragments of memories tugging at him, begging to be acknowledged. "And them?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who are they?" "They're the echoes of us," Zira explained. "Each of them carries a piece of our story, our love, our loss, our sacrifices. They're here to remind us of what we've shared and what we've yet to face." Ethan's heart pounded as the implications sank in. He wasn't just living one life with Zira and Rex. He was living all of them, intertwined through time and space, bound by something far greater than he could comprehend. The realization was overwhelming, yet it carried a strange comfort, as though a part of him had always known. As the night deepened, the spectral dogs began to fade, their forms dissolving into the mist. But the connection they had reignited in Ethan remained, burning brighter than ever. He turned to Zira, his jealousy and confusion giving way to something deeper, a love that spanned lifetimes, unbreakable and eternal. The cabin seemed to breathe in the silence of the night, every creak of its timbers resonating with an unseen rhythm. Ethan sat by the fire, his hands trembling as he clutched a steaming mug of tea. The warmth of the drink did nothing to thaw the chill that had settled in his chest since the vision. The spectral dogs were gone, their glowing forms absorbed into the mist, but their presence lingered, heavy and undeniable. Zira sat across from him, her posture calm, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames. Rex lay at her feet, his eyes half closed, but Ethan knew better now than to assume the dog was merely resting. Rex was always watching, always present in ways Ethan was only beginning to understand. "They showed you more than just memories," Zira said, breaking the silence. Her voice was low, soothing, but there was an edge to it, a weight of responsibility she carried like a second skin. "They gave you glimpses of what we've been, what we've lost." Ethan looked at her, his mind still reeling. "Why now?" he asked, his voice rough. "Why not before? Why show me any of this at all?" "Because you weren't ready," Zira replied simply. "And maybe you still aren't. But they're patient. They'll keep showing you until you understand." Before Ethan could respond, the air in the room shifted again. It wasn't as dramatic as the storm or the earlier visions, no blinding light, no sudden transformation, but it was palpable, a tingling that started in his fingertips and spread through his body. The fire dimmed, its flames flickering as though caught in a breeze that didn't exist. Rex lifted his head, his ears perking, and Zira's gaze sharpened, her eyes reflecting a knowing sadness. "Hold on to me," she whispered. Ethan barely had time to react before the room dissolved around him. The scent of rain-soaked earth hit him first, rich and alive. He was no longer in the cabin but standing in the middle of a dense forest. Towering trees rose around him, their branches intertwined like the fingers of giants. The air was heavy with moisture, and somewhere in the distance, a river roared, its sound muffled by the thick foliage. Zira was there, but once again she was different. Her hair was shorter, curling around her face in wild tendrils, and her clothes were rugged, functional leather and linen designed for survival, not beauty. Yet she was beautiful, in the raw, untamed way of someone who belonged to the wilderness. Beside her was Rex, leaner and smaller than the dog Ethan knew, but no less fierce. His fur was dark and streaked with mud, his movements precise and deliberate. Ethan looked down at himself and realized he was clad in rough, homespun garments. His hands held a bow, its string taut and ready, and a quiver of arrows hung at his back. He was no stranger to the weight of the weapon, his muscles remembering a skill his mind did not. "Ethan," Zira called, her voice cutting through the forest. She stood on a small rise, her expression urgent. "They're coming. We don't have much time." Before he could ask who they were, the answer revealed itself. Shapes emerged from the shadows, humanoid but twisted, their movements jerky and unnatural. Their eyes glowed faintly, much like the spectral dogs, but where the dogs radiated warmth and familiarity, these figures exuded malice. They carried crude weapons, axes, spears, clubs, and their guttural growls sent shivers down Ethan's spine. Instinct took over. He notched an arrow and loosed it, the projectile striking one of the creatures squarely in the chest. It stumbled but didn't fall, its gaze locking onto him with a snarl. Zira moved beside him, her blade flashing as she cut through another attacker. Rex darted between them, a blur of teeth and fury, holding the line against the tide of enemies. The battle was chaotic, a cacophony of snarls, shouts, and the clang of weapons. Ethan's heart pounded as he fought, his body moving with a familiarity that defied explanation. This wasn't just survival, it was a memory, a life he had lived, and the realization struck him like a physical blow. He knew this forest, these enemies, this moment. He had been here before. They fought as a unit, the three of them moving in perfect synchrony. Ethan's arrows flew true, Zira's blade danced with deadly precision, and Rex was a force of nature, his growls echoing through the trees. But the creatures kept coming, their numbers overwhelming. Then came the moment Ethan would never forget. One of the creatures, larger and faster than the others, broke through their defenses. It charged at Zira, its crude spear raised high. She turned too late, her blade already engaged with another enemy. Ethan shouted her name, but his voice was lost in the chaos. He reached for an arrow, but he knew it wouldn't be fast enough. Rex moved first. The dog lunged at the creature, his jaws locking onto its arm and dragging it to the ground. The spear clattered uselessly to the forest floor, but the creature retaliated with a savage swing of its clawed hand. Rex yelped, a sound that tore through Ethan like a dagger, but he didn't let go. He held on, buying Zira the moment she needed to finish the fight. When the battle ended, the forest fell silent. The creatures lay scattered, their bodies dissolving into wisps of smoke. Zira dropped her blade, her chest heaving as she turned to Rex. The dog lay motionless on the ground, his dark fur matted with blood. "Rex," she whispered, her voice breaking. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she touched his face. His eyes opened, weak but still full of the same unwavering devotion Ethan had seen in every lifetime. Ethan stood frozen, his heart aching as he watched the scene unfold. He knew how this would end. He could feel it in the marrow of his bones, a sorrow that transcended words. Rex gave a low, rumbling growl, not of pain but of satisfaction. His tail wagged once, weakly, before he closed his eyes. Zira let out a choked sob, her tears falling freely, and Ethan finally moved to her side. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his own eyes wet, and they sat together in the quiet of the forest, mourning their fallen companion. The vision faded, and Ethan found himself back in the cabin. The fire had gone out, the room plunged into shadow. Zira sat beside him, her face unreadable, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "That was one of the hardest lives we lived," she said softly. "We fought, we survived, but we lost so much." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Why do I remember it now? Why are they showing me this?" "Because you need to understand," Zira said, her hand brushing his. "It's not just about love, it's about sacrifice. Every life we've shared, Rex has been there, giving everything to keep us together. He's not just a dog, Ethan. He's a part of us." Ethan looked at Rex, who lay by the hearth, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The weight of the memories settled over him like a cloak, heavy but warm. For the first time, he saw Rex not just as a companion, but as a guardian, a bridge between lifetimes, carrying their bond across the sands of time. And for the first time, Ethan felt a flicker of understanding of the love and loss that had shaped them, and of the eternal connection they could never escape, nor would he ever want to. The morning after the visions, the cabin was eerily quiet. Ethan's mind was a storm of fragmented memories and raw emotions, each one clashing with the other in a battle he couldn't hope to win. He stood at the window, staring out at the mist that clung to the trees like a ghostly shroud. The spectral dogs were gone again, but their presence lingered, their a faint hum in the air, a weight pressing against his chest. Behind him, Zira moved through the kitchen, her steps deliberate and light, as if she was trying not to disturb the delicate balance of the moment. Rex lay in his usual spot by the hearth, his eyes tracking Ethan's every move. The connection between Zira and Rex seemed even stronger now, more vivid, and Ethan couldn't shake the sense that he was the intruder, the one who didn't belong. "Are you just going to stand there?" Zira's voice cut through the silence, sharp but not unkind. Ethan turned, his jaw tightening. "What do you expect me to do, Zira? Pretend like everything's normal, like I didn't just see all of that?" Her expression softened, but there was steel behind her gaze. "I'm not asking you to pretend. I'm asking you to face it, to understand it." "Understand what?" Ethan snapped, his voice rising. He gestured wildly toward Rex. "That he's more than a dog? That we've been living the same lives over and over, losing him again and again? That you've known all this while I've been stumbling around in the dark?" Zira stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. "I didn't choose to remember, Ethan. It's not something I could control. The memories came to me in fragments, just like they're coming to you now. And yes, it's painful, but it's also beautiful." "Beautiful?" Ethan let out a bitter laugh. "What's beautiful about losing him? About dying, fighting, suffering in every single life? What's beautiful about this game we're caught in?" Her eyes flared with a sudden intensity. "What's beautiful is the love that keeps bringing us back together. What's beautiful is the sacrifice, the courage, the way we've fought for each other again and again, no matter the cost." Ethan's breath hitched, his anger faltering under the weight of her words. But the jealousy, the doubt, still simmered beneath the surface. "And what about him?" he demanded, pointing at Rex. "Where do I fit into this? It feels like it's always been you and him, like I'm just an afterthought." The moment the words left his mouth, he regretted them. Zira's expression darkened, a storm brewing behind her eyes. "How dare you?" she said, her voice low and trembling with restrained fury. "How dare you reduce what we've shared to this petty jealousy? Do you think this is easy for me? For him?" She knelt beside Rex, her fingers threading through his fur. Rex looked up at her, his gaze steady, unyielding, and for a moment, Ethan felt like an intruder in an intimate moment he wasn't meant to witness. "You think Rex and I have some secret bond that excludes you?" Zira continued, her voice softer now but no less fierce. "You're wrong, Ethan. Rex has always been a part of us. He's the thread that holds us together, the anchor that keeps us from drifting apart. Without him, there wouldn't be an us." Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the room shifted. The air grew heavy, charged with an energy that prickled along his skin. The fire dimmed, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. Rex stood, his body tense, his gaze fixed on Ethan. The largest of the spectral dogs appeared, stepping through the far wall as if it weren't there. Its form shimmered, solid and insubstantial all at once, and its eyes, those burning, otherworldly eyes, pinned Ethan in place. The dog's presence was overwhelming, filling the room with an unspoken challenge. Zira rose, her hands still resting on Rex's back. "This is what you've been afraid of," she said, her voice quiet. "This is what you need to face." The spectral dog advanced, its movements fluid, deliberate. Ethan's pulse raced as it stopped inches from him, its gaze boring into his. For a moment he felt as though he were being unmade, his very soul laid bare under the weight of its scrutiny. And then the visions came. He was in a medieval castle, the air thick with the scent of stone and fire. He wore a knight's armor, the weight of it pressing down on him like a second skin. The clash of swords echoed through the halls, mingling with the screams of the dying. Ethan's hands gripped the hilt of a bloody blade, and he turned to see Zira, her face pale and resolute, clutching a dagger as she stood over a fallen enemy. Rex was there, too smaller than in the desert vision but no less fierce. His fur was streaked with blood, his teeth bared as he snarled at the soldiers advancing on them. Ethan's heart pounded as he fought to protect Zira, his blade meeting steel with every swing. But no matter how many enemies he struck down, more took their place. And then came the betrayal. One of the knights, a man Ethan recognized as a friend, turned on him, his sword slicing through Ethan's side. Pain exploded through his body as he fell to his knees, his vision blurring. Zira screamed, lunging forward to defend him, but she was outnumbered. Rex threw himself into the fray, his growls echoing like thunder, but even he couldn't hold them off. Ethan's last memory of that life was of Zira cradling Rex's lifeless body, her tears falling onto his bloodied fur. The pain in her eyes was a mirror of his own, a grief so profound it felt like the world itself had shattered. The vision faded and Ethan was back in the cabin, his knees buckling as he gasped for air. Zira was at his side in an instant, her hands gripping his shoulders, "Do you see now?" she whispered. "Do you understand?" Ethan looked at her, his eyes brimming with tears. "We lost him," he choked out. "We've lost him so many times. And yet he always comes back," Zira said. "Just like we do. Because we're not meant to be apart." Ethan turned to Rex, who was watching him with a calm that belied the depth of his understanding. In that moment, Ethan saw the truth not just in Rex, but in himself, in Zira. They were pieces of a whole, fragments of a love that had endured beyond death, beyond time itself. The spectral dog stepped forward again, pressing its head against Ethan's chest. A warmth spread through him, a sense of acceptance, of belonging. For the first time, he felt the weight of his jealousy lift, replaced by a profound sense of gratitude. When the apparition faded, Ethan looked at Zira and Rex, his heart full. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice trembling. "For doubting. For not seeing." Zira smiled, her eyes shining. "You see now. That's all that matters." Rex wagged his tail, a gesture so simple yet so deeply comforting that Ethan couldn't help but laugh, even through his tears. Together, they sat by the fire, their bond stronger than ever, ready to face whatever came next. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across the cabin walls. Ethan sat cross-legged on the floor, his back resting against the cool wood of the couch. His breath was slow and steady, his mind still reeling from the cascade of visions, emotions, and revelations that had unraveled his understanding of life itself. Zira sat across from him, her presence radiating calm, while Rex lay between them, his eyes half closed but alert, as if standing sentinel over the fragile harmony they had just begun to build. The room was heavy with silence, the kind that pressed down on the soul, forcing it to confront truths that couldn't be avoided. Ethan felt stripped bare, his jealousy, his doubts, and his fear laid out in front of him like shards of glass. Yet, in the emptiness left behind, something new had begun to bloom, a fragile, unfamiliar sense of peace. "Zira," he began, his voice rough, barely above a whisper. "All this time, I thought I wasn't enough. I thought it was you and Rex against the world, and I was just there." Zira tilted her head, her eyes soft and luminous in the firelight. "You were never just there, Ethan. You've always been the center of it all. Every life we've lived, every battle we've fought, every sacrifice we've made, it's always been for us." "But it didn't feel like that," Ethan said, his throat tightening. "I felt like I was competing with something I couldn't even understand." Zira leaned forward, her fingers brushing against his. Her touch was warm, grounding, a lifeline in the storm of his emotions. "It wasn't a competition," she said softly. "It was fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of what it means to love something so vast, so eternal, that it defies comprehension." Ethan met her gaze, the truth of her words settling into his chest like a weight and a balm all at once. "And Rex?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What is he? Who is he?" "Who is he's not just a dog, Zira. I know that now." A faint smile tugged at the corners of Zira's lips, but her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Rex is everything. He's been our protector, our guide, our bridge to each other when the world tried to tear us apart. In every life, he's found us, even when we couldn't find ourselves." Rex lifted his head, his amber eyes meeting Ethan's. In that moment, Ethan felt something profound and unspoken understanding, a connection that went beyond words, beyond thought. He saw flashes of their lives together, not as a series of fragmented memories, but as a single, continuous thread. Each life was a bead on the necklace of eternity, and Rex was the clasp that held it all together. The air in the room shifted, a subtle ripple that made Ethan's skin prickle. He glanced toward the window and froze. The spectral dogs had returned, their glowing forms materializing from the shadows as if summoned by the weight of the moment. They stood in a semicircle, their eyes gleaming with a light that seemed to pierce through Ethan's very soul. Zira rose to her feet, her movements slow and deliberate. She extended a hand toward Ethan, her expression both solemn and tender. "It's time," she said. Time for what Ethan asked, though he already felt the answer rising in his chest like a tide. "To embrace it," Zira replied. "To stop running from what we are." Ethan hesitated, his heart pounding. But as he looked at Zira, at Rex, at the spectral dogs that carried the weight of their shared history, he felt the last remnants of his fear dissolve. He reached for Zira's hand, her warmth grounding him as he rose to stand beside her. The largest of the spectral dogs stepped forward, its form more solid now, its fur shimmering with an otherworldly glow. It was the embodiment of strength, of loyalty, of a love that refused to be extinguished. It stopped before Ethan, its gaze steady, and bowed its head. Ethan knelt, his breath hitching as he reached out to touch the creature's head. The moment his fingers brushed its fur, the world around him shifted. The three of them stood at the edge of a vast, star-filled expanse. The ground beneath their feet was made of light, shimmering and fluid, and the air was thick with a hum that resonated deep within their bones. The spectral dogs surrounded them, their forms merging and separating, like waves crashing against the shore. Zara turned to Ethan, her eyes filled with tears. "This is where it all began," she said. "This is where we were first bound." Ethan's gaze was drawn upward, where three celestial forms blazed in the heavens: a brilliant star, a steady flame, and a radiant beam of light. They pulsed in unison, their energies weaving together in an intricate dance. Ethan felt the truth of it deep in his core. The star was Rex, guiding and enduring. The flame was himself, passionate and ever burning. And the light was Zara, illuminating their path, holding them together. "We've always been connected," Zara said, her voice trembling. "Not just in one life, but in every life. We're fragments of the same whole, drawn back together again and again." As she spoke, the celestial forms descended, their light enveloping Ethan, Zara, and Rex. Ethan felt a surge of warmth, of love so overwhelming that it brought him to his knees. The memories of every life they had shared flooded through him, not as separate events, but as a single, continuous story. He saw their joys and their sorrows, their triumphs and their losses, all woven together in a tapestry that defied time. And at the center of it all was Rex, the dog who had been a guardian, a guide, and a bridge across eternity. Ethan realized, with a clarity that shook him to his core, that Rex was not just a companion. He was their anchor, their constant, the embodiment of the love that had carried them through every trial. When the light faded, they were back in the cabin. The spectral dogs were gone, their forms dissolved into the ether, but their presence lingered, warm and reassuring. Rex lay at Ethan's feet, his gaze calm, knowing. Ethan knelt beside him, running a hand through his fur. "Thank you," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. "For everything." Rex wagged his tail, a small but profound gesture that spoke of forgiveness, of acceptance, of love. Zara knelt beside them, her arms wrapping around Ethan and Rex. The three of them stayed like that for a long time, their breathing synchronized, their hearts beating as one. Ethan felt the weight of their shared history settle into his soul, not as a burden, but as a gift. For the first time, he understood the truth of their bond, not just with Zara, but with Rex, with the lives they had lived, and the lives they had yet to live. It wasn't about jealousy or competition. It was about unity, about the unbreakable connection that bound them together across time and space. In that moment, Ethan knew he was no longer afraid. Whatever lay ahead, he would face it with Zara and Rex by his side. Together, they were whole. Together, they were eternal. The dawn broke quietly, its golden light filtering through the cabin's frost-rimmed windows. The fire in the hearth had long since gone out, leaving only a faint trail of smoke curling upward. Ethan stirred on the couch, the heavy weight of sleep slowly lifting. For the first time in what felt like lifetimes, he awoke with a sense of calm, as if the storm inside him had finally settled. Rex was lying at his feet, his breathing steady and rhythmic. Zara was already awake, perched on the windowsill with her knees drawn to her chest. The soft morning light caressed her features, making her seem otherworldly, like a memory from a dream that refused to fade. Ethan watched her for a long moment, his chest tightening not with jealousy, not with doubt, but with a profound, unshakable love. As if sensing his gaze, Zara turned to him, her lips curving into a soft smile. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed to melt the frost on the windows. Ethan sat up, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "Morning," he replied, his voice still rough from sleep. He glanced at Rex, who opened one amber eye and gave a lazy wag of his tail. "You didn't wake me. You needed rest," Zara said, her tone gentle but firm. "Last night was a lot." Ethan exhaled, the memories of the night flooding back. The visions, the spectral dogs, the overwhelming sense of unity that had bound the three of them together. It was all still fresh, raw, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a gift, one he was finally ready to embrace. "Are they gone?" Ethan asked, glancing toward the window. The mist that had lingered for so long was gone, the forest beyond the cabin alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. "For now," Zara said, turning her gaze back to the woods. "They've given us what we need. The rest is up to us." Ethan stood, stretching as he walked to the window. The world outside seemed sharper, more vibrant than he had ever noticed before. The leaves on the trees glimmered with dew, the sunlight casting golden streaks across the ground. It was as if the forest itself had been reborn, its energy reflecting the shift that had taken place within him. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice quiet. Zara looked at him, her expression a mix of tenderness and determination. "We move forward," she said simply. "Together." The day passed in a strange, dreamlike rhythm. Ethan and Zira worked side by side, tending to the small tasks that kept the cabin running, splitting firewood, preparing a simple meal, feeding Rex. Each action felt charged with a new significance, as if they were not just building a life together but honoring the countless lives they had already shared. Rex followed them everywhere, his presence a quiet reassurance. Ethan found himself watching the dog with a newfound sense of wonder, marveling at the depth of the bond they shared. It wasn't just love, it was loyalty, devotion, and something deeper, something eternal. As the afternoon wore on, Zira led Ethan to the edge of the forest, a place where the trees parted to reveal a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a single tree, its gnarled branches reaching skyward like outstretched arms. It was ancient, its bark etched with scars that told stories Ethan could only begin to imagine. "This is where it all began," Zira said, her voice barely above a whisper. "In this life, at least." Ethan stepped closer, his hand brushing the rough surface of the tree's trunk. He felt a jolt of energy, a pulse that seemed to travel from the tree into his very being. Images flashed in his mind, fragments of this life and the others, all woven together into a tapestry that defied time. Zira joined him, her hand covering his. "This tree has been here longer than any of us," she said. "It's seen everything, the beginnings, the endings, the spaces in between. It's a witness to our story." Ethan turned to her, his heart full. "And our story isn't over," he said, his voice steady. Zira smiled, and for a moment, the weight of all they had endured seemed to lift. "No," she said. "It's only just beginning." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ethan, Zira, and Rex sat on the cabin's porch. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. Rex rested his head on Ethan's knee, his eyes half closed in contentment. Ethan reached down, scratching behind Rex's ears. "I don't think I ever really understood what it meant to love," he said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Not until now." Zira turned to him, her gaze soft but searching. "What does it mean to you now?" Ethan paused, his fingers brushing through Rex's fur. "It means letting go of fear," he said finally. "It means accepting that love isn't just about one moment, one life. It's about everything, every joy, every loss, every sacrifice. It's about being willing to face whatever comes, knowing that we're not alone." Zira's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she didn't look away. "That's what I've always wanted you to see," she said. "I see it now," Ethan replied, his voice steady. He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "And I'm not letting go." As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Ethan felt a sense of peace he had never known before. The cabin, the forest, the lives they had shared, and the ones still waiting for them, all of it felt perfectly aligned, as if the universe itself had shifted to make room for their love. Rex let out a contented sigh, his tail thumping against the wooden porch. Ethan looked down at him, a smile tugging at his lips. "You've been holding us together this whole time, haven't you?" he said. Rex lifted his head, his amber eyes meeting Ethan's. In that gaze, Ethan saw everything: the sacrifices, the devotion, the unbreakable bond that had carried them through lifetimes. It was humbling, and it was beautiful. Zira leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder, her voice a soft murmur in the quiet night. "He'll always be with us, no matter what." Ethan wrapped an arm around her, his other hand resting on Rex. The three of them sat together, the stars above them a reminder of the vastness of their story, the eternity they shared. And for the first time, Ethan didn't feel overwhelmed by the enormity of it. He felt grateful. Their love was not bound by time, not constrained by the limitations of a single life. It was a flame that burned brighter with each passing moment, each shared experience, each new beginning. Together they were whole. Together they were infinite.